Bethlehem is home to one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Christianity, the Church of the Nativity, which is built over the Grotto of the Nativity, the traditional cave in which Jesus was said to have been born in Bethlehem. But is this really the site of Jesus' birth? What if I told you that this site is the result of a mistranslation? Hey, I'm Dr. Bob Cargill. Thanks for joining us. As you make your way through the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, you are directed around to the right of the altar, which leads to a staircase descending to a point directly beneath the altar. It is here that pilgrims find the Grotto of the Nativity, the well-worn, tapestry-covered remains of a cave that possesses at its center a hole in the now marble floor, the edge of which is preserved by a 14-point silver star and ringed by an assortment of hanging oil lamps and paintings of religious icons that keep watch over what is commemorated as the traditional birthplace of baby Jesus. The problem with the grotto for historians, however, is that there is no archaeological evidence that this is, in fact, the place of Jesus' birth. Now, just because a site does not possess an archaeological record does not mean that the site cannot evoke emotions in the hearts and the minds of believers. But the Grotto of the Nativity has no archaeological evidence to support the claim that Jesus was born here. In addition, there is no clear biblical reference that points to this particular location as the birthplace of Jesus. So where did the story of this cave come from? By examining secondary texts, we learn that the legend of the cave was first documented by the Christian apologist Justin Martyr, who claimed that when there was no room at the inn, Joseph and Mary took refuge in a cave which contained the manger in which Jesus was said to have been born. Justin first wrote about Jesus' birth in a cave in his dialogue with Trypho around 155 CE, so the mid-2nd century, as part of his harmonization of Matthew's and Luke's birth narratives. In chapter 78, Justin states, "But when the child was born in Bethlehem, since Joseph could not find a lodging in that village, he took up his quarters in a certain cave near the village. And while they were there, Mary brought forth the Christ." So where did Justin get the idea that Jesus was born in a cave? The answer lies in a mistranslation. In chapter 70 of his dialogue with Trypho, Justin quotes at length from Isaiah 33, 13 through 19, and specifically from verse 16, saying, "He shall dwell in the lofty cave of the strong rock." The problem is that the Hebrew text of Isaiah 33 says that for the one who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, in verse 15, that he, quote, will live on the heights, in verse 16, and metzadot selaim misgabo, or fortresses of rocks are his refuge. Note that the Hebrew text says nothing about a cave. Rather, the word metzadot, here in the plural, meaning fortresses, is actually from the same Hebrew word that gives us the name of Masada, the nearly impenetrable aerial fortress in the southern desert of Israel. It's not a cave, it's a high place. Likewise, the word Selah, here in the plural, is the standard Hebrew word for rock, and Misgav, here in the possessive, is the Hebrew word for refuge. So, if the Hebrew prophecy of Isaiah 33:16 says nothing about a cave, but instead says that for the righteous man, he will live on the heights, and fortresses of rocks are his refuge, exactly how did Justin Martyr get a reference to a cave from Isaiah 33:16? And why did he apply this prophecy to Jesus when no gospel author thought to do so? The answer comes from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which translates the passage, "He shall dwell in an exalted cave," spelaion, of strong rock. Note that the Septuagint translated the elevated Hebrew word metzadot, or fortress, with the chthonic Greek word spelaion, meaning cave, den, or grotto. The Septuagint then takes the Hebrew noun for heights, meromim, from the previous line and translates it as a dative adjective, hupselo, meaning exalted, modifying spelaion, or cave, resulting in hupselo spelaio, meaning exalted cave or exalted grotto. But the Septuagint isn't done. It also translates the Hebrew noun and the third-person pronominal suffix, his, misgabo, meaning his stronghold, with the Greek adjective iskouras, meaning strong, and then uses it to modify the Greek noun for rock, petras, even though in the Hebrew, salaim or rocks is a genitive or possessive, modifying the word for fortress, metzadot. So the Hebrew text, he will dwell on the heights, fortresses of rock are his refuge, is rendered by the Septuagint as, he will dwell in an exalted cave of strong rock. So the Septuagint's translation, but that's where we get the cave. Justin Martyr was obviously reading from the Septuagint's translation of Isaiah 33:16, not the Hebrew version, which was typical for the time. But how did Justin come to apply this admittedly creative translation to Jesus? Justin claims in his Dialogue 78 that the cave mentioned in the Septuagint's translation of Isaiah 33:16 refers not to the cave revered by the Mithraic mysteries, which is the actual context of this section of his dialogue with Trypho, but to the cave in which Jesus was born. Quote, he took up his quarters in a certain cave near the village, end of quote. Justin was reading the Septuagint of Isaiah's reference to the cave and the reference to the Israelite king in the next verse, Isaiah 33:17, as a prophetic allusion to the birth of Jesus some 700 years later. Remember, this is Justin Martyr's creation in the 2nd century CE. The Gospel writers never allude to this specific prophecy of Isaiah in reference to Jesus, because maybe, unlike Justin Martyr, they could read Hebrew. But Justin Martyr clearly saw a connection between the Septuagint's mistranslation of Isaiah 33:16 and Jesus' birth, and in his apologetic critique of the Mithraic mysteries, began the tradition of the birthplace of Jesus being in a cave in Bethlehem. Again, this is despite the fact that the verb in Isaiah 33:16 clearly reads, he shall dwell, Hebrew yishkon, Greek oikese, and not will be born. This was an original creation of Justin Martyr. And this is why the Gospel authors never mention this prophecy as pertaining to Jesus' birth. It's not about Jesus, and the Hebrew doesn't say what Justin thinks it says. This is how legends are made, and this is why when you visit the birthplace of Jesus, you visit a highly exalted cave over which an entire church was built, despite the fact there is absolutely no archaeological evidence or any biblical evidence to support this claim, and the tradition is rooted in the Septuagint's mistranslation of the Hebrew. Now, Justin Martyr's interpretation quickly took root. The 2nd century Proto-Evangelium, or Gospel of James, written shortly after Justin's dialogue, mentions a cave, as does the 3rd century Greek Christian theologian Origen of Alexandria, who wrote in Against Celsus regarding the grotto, there is shown at Bethlehem the cave where he was born, and the manger in the cave where he was wrapped in swaddling clothes. And this site is greatly talked of in surrounding places, even among the enemies of the faith, it being said that in this cave was born that Jesus who was worshipped and reverenced by the Christians." End of quote. So Origen repeats Justin Martyr's legend of the cave of Jesus' birth in the early 3rd century, over 200 years after Jesus was born. And as this tradition grew, the cave became the place associated with the birth of Jesus. In 327, Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine the Great, began construction on the first basilica in Bethlehem, the Church of the Nativity, as part of her larger campaign to commemorate sites traditionally associated with Jesus. These shrines formally signified the empire's, and therefore the church's, endorsement of these places throughout the Holy Land as the places where the events in the Bible actually took place. The basilica was dedicated in 339 and stood until the middle of the 6th century, when it was burned to the ground during the Samaritan Revolt of 529. A larger basilica replaced it during the reign of the Emperor Justinian I, which incorporated many elements present in the original basilica, including the location of the grotto. And it is this 6th century basilica, the Church of the Nativity, that has stood throughout the ages, although it has experienced extended periods of disrepair, especially under Ottoman control in the mid-19th century. Despite extensive earthquake damage to the buildings, feuding between the Crusaders and the Greek Orthodox Church over control of the basilica, and even the theft of the star covering the grotto, the Church of the Nativity still stands as a symbol commemorating the birth of Jesus, as well as the power of creative translation and textual interpretation. I'm Dr. Bob Cargill.